Hey, how are you? Tell me about it. Yeah, I covered DOJ, so they didn't have yeah, I'm DOJ. So in these cases, it can be good. Sometimes it's good to be a DOJ. Yeah, you joined the race. I was on standby. I had a bag ready to go. There was a major problem somewhere. You know, I don't think Arizona is ready for that. Thank you. Really not a major problem anywhere. You know, but I don't know. I mean, big time before that. I was like, whoa. I didn't think this was going to even be this close. Oh, the more. I mean, she was. I mean, just right. Even the first instance of something. Won't even mention. Are you going on the trip? Hi. How are you? Good. Who the hell is your neighbor today? What's going on here?
He literally got us in there like before the we like did live shots like
Early. Well, I mean, I'm not here.
Good afternoon, everybody. Okay. So this afternoon at Howard University, the president will thank staff, volunteers, and everyone who helped ensure everyone could make their voices heard in the midterm election. As you heard him say yesterday, the president, with their votes, the American people have spoken and proven once again that democracy is who we are. And while we don't know all the results just yet, we do know that states across the country saw record voter turnout. And voters also spoke clearly about their concerns, from fighting inflation to addressing crime to protecting our democracy and the right to choose. These are issues the president has been laser focused on from day one and it will remain top priorities for him. And as he said yesterday as well, no matter what the final tally in all these races will be, he is prepared to work across the aisle to deliver for the American people. That's what people want, and that's what the American people deserve. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who is going to talk through the president's upcoming travels. Jake? It's been a long couple of days, my friend. Go ahead, Jake.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll take a few minutes to walk through the trip over the next several days, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. And I would just ask for your patience because there's quite a bit to get through, given an action-packed schedule that the president has across 3 stops over a week. Before I get into the president's travel across North Africa and Asia, I want to provide a brief update on our efforts to ensure Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself. Today, the United States will be announcing another package of security assistance for Ukraine, including important air defense contributions like missiles for Hawk air defense systems, as well as 4 U.S. Avenger air defense systems that come equipped with Stinger missiles. This equipment will complement other air defense contributions announced by our allies and partners in the context of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group that Secretary Austin chairs. When I was in Kyiv last week, I had the chance to consult directly with President Zelensky and his team on the ground about what Ukraine needs to be in the strongest position possible on the battlefield. This increased air defense will be critical for Ukraine as Russia continues to use cruise missiles and Iranian-made drones to attack critical civilian infrastructure. With that, let me turn to the trip. As you all know, tonight the President departs for Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where tomorrow he will participate in the COP27 climate conference and hold a bilateral meeting with President el-Sisi. The President heads to COP27 with historic momentum on climate, thanks to the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and other significant steps that put us on an enduring path towards meeting our ambitions and clean energy goals. While he's on the ground, he'll speak to his personal commitment to addressing the climate crisis. He'll highlight some of the progress the United States has made, both here at home and in rallying action on climate around the world. And he'll underscore the need to go further, faster, to help the most vulnerable communities build their resilience without losing sight of the need for the world, and particularly for the major economies, to cut emissions drastically in this decisive decade. While in Egypt, President Biden will also meet with President el-Sisi, as I mentioned, to discuss a number of critical regional and bilateral issues following on his visit to the Middle East earlier this year, where he also had an opportunity to sit with President el-Sisi. On Saturday, he'll arrive in Cambodia and attend the U.S.-ASEAN summit. He'll reaffirm the United States' strong support for ASEAN centrality and build on the achievements of the historic U.S.-ASEAN Special Summit that was held in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. He will also hold a bilateral meeting with 2022 ASEAN Chair, the Prime Minister of Cambodia, Hun Sen. On Sunday in Cambodia, he will participate in the East Asia Summit. He will underscore U.S. support for the ASEAN-led regional architecture in the Indo-Pacific and discuss opportunities to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific that is more connected, more prosperous, more secure, and more resilient. He'll also hold bilateral and trilateral meetings with the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of Korea in light of the continuing nuclear and missile threats posed by the DPRK, as well as growing alignment among our countries in promoting peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. On Monday, President Biden will be in Bali, Indonesia, where he will hold a bilateral meeting with Indonesian President Joko Widodo. He will thank President Widodo for his leadership, his chairmanship of the G20, and highlight the growing importance of the U.S.-Indonesia strategic partnership. Later in the day on Monday, President Biden will hold a bilateral meeting with President Xi Jinping of China. This is the first time that President Biden and President Xi will have this is the first time that they will meet face-to-face since President Biden became president. President Biden has made it a priority to keep lines of communication open with President Xi, to responsibly manage the competition between our two countries, and he believes there is no more important channel than that between the leaders of the United States and China. From day one of the Biden administration, our approach to the PRC has followed the same fundamentals. Invest in the foundations of our strength here at home, align our efforts with a network of allies and partners, and compete responsibly to defend and advance our interests and those of like-minded nations. The meeting between President Biden and President Xi will be an in-depth and substantive opportunity to better understand one another's priorities and intentions, to address differences, and to identify areas where we can work together. Because working together to address common problems is in our interest, and because it is what the world expects of responsible powers. On Tuesday and Wednesday, the President will attend the G20 summit, where he'll focus on a range of pressing global economic challenges, especially for emerging and vulnerable economies, including energy security and the clean energy transition, food security, debt relief for low and middle-income countries, multilateral development bank reform, and the launch of a pandemic preparedness fund. He will also rally like-minded nations to speak out forcefully against Russia's illegal invasion and illegal war in Ukraine, which has exacerbated many of these challenges. President Biden will join with fellow G7 and G20 leaders to host an event on the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, where the U.S. and other partners will announce a series of high-impact infrastructure projects across the developing world. The President will have the opportunity to hold a number of other bilateral meetings on the margins of the G20, and will announce those in due course. Among others, we expect that he'll have the chance to sit for the first time with the prime ministers of both the United Kingdom and Italy, the new prime ministers who have both recently taken office. This trip comes at an important moment, and President Biden heads off with the wind at his back. The United States has helped rally the world to oppose Russian aggression in Ukraine. We have built a strong foundation of engagement with allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. We've launched impactful new initiatives in the Indo-Pacific, including PGII and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. We're leading collective efforts on climate, health, food, and energy security. And we've made far-reaching foundational investments in our industrial and innovation base and in modernizing our infrastructure here at home. So we believe that we are in a strong position to both navigate competition and to work with partners to solve the great challenges of our time. That's what President Biden intends to do on this trip, and thank you all for your patience, and look forward to answering your questions. Yes?
Thanks, Jake. In the briefing we had earlier about the Xi meeting, there was a mention of some proposals on areas where there could be some collaboration. Was that specifically regarding tariffs and trade negotiations, and will there be any progress on that?
I don't think you should look at this meeting as one in which there's going to be specific deliverables announced. Rather, the two leaders are going to give direction to their teams to work on a number of areas, both areas where we have differences and areas where we can work together. That will include direction to the economic teams to address our concerns about Chinese economic practices and to deal with some of the underlying differences of view and perspective on economic matters. It will also involve giving direction to try to work on issues on which we do have common interest, whether it's health, counter-narcotics, climate, or other areas. Yeah.
So, two-part question on the Asia trip. First off, what impact does the midterm elections have on the president's ability to deliver on American commitments overseas? And secondly, now that Xi is through the Congress in China, does that affect his willingness to work with the United States or embolden him to conflict with the United States more? What impact do you think that could have?
So first, when it comes to the president leaving after the results on Tuesday and the incoming results that continue to flow in, he feels very good about where things stand, and he feels like he is going out on this trip with the wind very much at his back. And that gives him an excellent opportunity both to deal with competitors from a strong position and to rally allies. And as far as the continuing support of the United States for critical foreign policy initiatives, the president was clear yesterday, and he will be very clear on the trip that there will be strong, enduring, unflagging, unwavering support for Ukraine in the face of Russia's aggression. There is a bipartisan basis and foundation to our approach to China, and he looks forward to working with both parties on that issue, whatever the final composition of the two houses of Congress are. But in general, he goes out on this trip feeling like the results from Tuesday show that the American people, are sending him out onto the world stage in a very strong position.
China issue, what impact does the Xi's new term in the Communist Congress? What impact does that have on their willingness to work with the U.S., do you think?
That remains to be seen, and part of what the president is eager to determine is in a face-to-face meeting where for the first time since he's come into office, President Biden has come into the presidency, he will get to sit in the same room with Xi Jinping, be direct and straightforward with him as he always is, and expect the same in return from Xi, and then he can make his judgments on that basis about how to take things forward. That's why this meeting is extremely important. There just is no substitute for this kind of leader-to-leader communication in navigating and managing such a consequential relationship. Yeah.
Jake, thanks so much for doing the briefing. I want to ask you about Brittany Griner and then President Putin more broadly, but she's been moved to a penal colony and apparently hasn't been seen for 6 days. What can you tell us about her condition? When is the last time that U.S. officials had any type of update on her condition? And what is your level of optimism that now that we are past the midterms, President Putin will be more potentially serious about negotiating her release?
So I have to protect the confidentiality of our dealings with her family and some of our consular dealings with Russian officials, but I will tell you on a daily basis our embassy in Moscow is focused on ensuring that they are on top of Brittany Griner's condition, location, and how the Russian government is treating her. She is being held unjustly. She should be released immediately. We have made that clear to our Russian counterparts, and we have put forward a series of proposals over the last several months for how we could resolve her case as well as the case of Paul Whelan to bring them both home. So far, the Russians have not shown a willingness to engage in that back and forth to produce a result. As President Biden said yesterday, we are hopeful that we can renew that dialogue and find a way to get these cases resolved and to get both Brittany and Paul home. I can't handicap it. I can't give you any predictions. All I can tell you is President Biden is personally engaged on this. I am personally engaged on this. We are dealing with the Russians at very senior levels, and our diplomats on the ground are working overtime to ensure that they are staying in close touch with their Russian counterparts on her case.
And I know President Biden got a version of this yesterday, but if you could just help us understand this moment right now and what it means, the fact that Russia has pulled out of Kherson, is the U.S. encouraging Ukraine to now start peace talks with Russia? Is there any sense that that might actually happen? And does it lower your concern or does it impact your concern at all about Putin's potential use of a nuclear weapon?
So first, this is a significant military milestone for the Ukrainians if, in fact, it happens that Russia follows through and withdraws to the far side of the Dnieper River. Of course, we're going to watch actions and not just announcements to see what actually unfolds. But if this does come to pass, that will mean in the Battle of Kyiv, in the Battle of Kherson, in the Battle of Kharkiv, the Ukrainians will have prevailed against an invading, marauding force that conducted an illegal war in their country. But of course, it's not the end of the war, because Russia continues to occupy parts of Ukrainian territory. We are continuing to support the Ukrainians in their effort to defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity. And as the president said yesterday, we're guided by a very simple principle: nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. It is ultimately up to Ukraine to make determinations about its diplomatic course. It is our job to put them in the best position on the battlefield so that when and if there is an opportunity for diplomacy, they're in the best position at the bargaining table. I don't have anything to offer you today about the likelihood or the proximity of any kind of negotiations. Right now, what the Ukrainians are focused on is defending their critical infrastructure against these barbaric attacks that are killing civilians and harming the basic functioning of the economy, and trying to take their territory back. The United States is not pressuring Ukraine. We're not insisting on things with Ukraine. What we are doing is consulting as partners and showing our support, not just through public statements or moral support, but through the tangible physical support of the kind of military assistance I mentioned before. Yeah.
Thank you, Jake. Just a quick follow-up on Kherson first. You said that you'd be watching actions instead of just hearing what they're saying. Do you have any indication that a withdrawal has actually started?
We do see some indications of movement consistent with what the announcements were yesterday, but this is an involved operation. The Russians had flowed a significant number of forces and personnel into Kherson City and to the west side of the Dnieper River. So it's not the kind of thing you just snap your fingers and it's done. So we will want to see how it actually unfolds in the coming days before we make any judgments about whether the Russians are fully following through on the announcement they made, or whether they're going to choose to change course at some point. And we'll continue to stay in close touch with the Ukrainians on that as well.
And to follow up on Kristen's questions about Griner, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I didn't hear whether you have a condition for her, a current condition how she's doing since she's been transferred to the penal colony.
Sorry, in the start of my answer to Kristen, what I said is to protect confidentiality. I'm not going to speak to her condition from the podium today.
And one more question, unrelated, sorry. The president yesterday said that it should be, that the Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter should be looked into as a potential threat to national security. Can you offer anything about why? And he also said there are many ways to look into that. How would you look into that?
Well, you heard the president yesterday, and the CFIUS process is the normal process through which transactions that might have a national security nexus get reviewed, and I will defer to the CFIUS process rather than comment on it further from this podium.
Thanks, Chief. The G20, would it be better if Putin was there? I mean, he's arguably the most consequential player on some of those big issues that are going to be discussed, food security and energy security.
Well, you'll have to ask President Putin in the Kremlin why he's decided not to go, as it appears he has decided not to go. It's not really for me to comment on. What I can say is that President Biden is going to advance an affirmative agenda on all the issues that I laid out, and he'll do that regardless of who's sitting in the chair on the Russian side.
On China, can you give an update on the kind of efforts that were launched before about a sustained dialogue on risk reduction, the strategic stability talks? Where do those stand? What has been the impediment to try to get those risk reduction talks going?
Well, first, we do believe that with the U.S. and Chinese militaries operating in proximity to one another in the Indo-Pacific, in many different areas of the Indo-Pacific, it is important to have channels of communication between our militaries so that we can avoid accidents, miscalculation, escalation, and we can avoid having anything that might tip over into conflict. That to us is important, that type of communication, that type of engagement. Further, we've expressed our concerns about aspects of strategic stability in the context of China as we have in the context of Russia. And we've indicated that good substantive dialogue between significant countries like the U.S. and China can help produce greater stability over time. I'm not going to get ahead of the conversations between the two presidents. These topics, of course, will be touched on. What comes of that, in what form, over what time, with what participation, I won't get ahead of today. Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. The president said yesterday that he found it interesting that Russia waited until after the midterm elections to announce this withdrawal from Kherson. The implication being that Russia was held off on withdrawing to have some kind of effect on the midterms. So was the president just speculating there, or do you guys have any evidence to back that up? And then I have a Griner question.
I think what the president said should be taken at face value. He thought it was interesting timing that you had the election on November 8th, and on November 9th they made the significant announcement at Kherson, and I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. And then on Brittany Griner, given that the president said that he would be open to meeting Putin to discuss Brittany Griner's situation, would the president be willing to meet with the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, at the G20 to discuss Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan?
There's no plans for the president to meet with the Russian foreign minister.
So I want to ask you about Lebanon. Do you think this administration will deal with any elected president in Lebanon is backed up from Iran and Syria?
Well, I don't want to get ahead of